Welcome to the Hollywood Scholar. I'm Jed Morgan, and I just finished Rings of Power Episode 3, and try as I might, I never was able to find out what Episode 3 of Rings of Power is called, so I'm just going to call it Episode 3 at this point. I have zero investment or zero energy to talk about this episode because it is a giant nothing burger. I think it is marginally better than the previous two episodes, mainly because there's a substantial less amount of dialogue in this episode than the previous ones, and so there's less points for it to fall apart at the very seams. Like, there was less opportunity for non sequiturs, for clunky transitions, for just terrible dialogue in general. There's less opportunities for that. So I think it was marginally better, but character-wise, it was just as bad as the previous. Costume and set design wise, it was just as bad as the previous. And lore wise, once again, all my previous criticisms of the show, lore wise and also design wise, still apply for this episode. Like, the haircuts are just as bad, the costumes are just as bad. I'll mention those a little bit, but if I miss any lore wise stuff that I don't recognize, please let me know in the comments below. If you are a lore expert, I'd love to know. I just don't get a lot of that stuff, but overall, a lot of that same criticism applies, but I'm going to be focusing on the writing for this episode. And yeah, again, it is just as bad as the previous ones in so many respects. Its only saving factor is because there was a lot less dialogue, but inversely, it was also far more boring. You could condense this episode down to roughly 15 minutes worth of plot and lose absolutely nothing. The Hobbit was often criticized for being bloated. Well, the Rings of Power takes that criticism tenfold and is incredibly bloated. All three episodes are probably 45 minutes worth of a film so far for setup and plot. There is a giant nothing burger of boringness and non-consequentiality in this show, if nothing else, beyond the dialogue, beyond the terrible characterization of the consequential plot. There's so little of it that you could trim this down into 45 minutes and make it so much more tighter and so much more compelling, and honestly make it a little bit better. The dialogue and the writing would still be terrible, but making it 45 minutes long would be a lot more bearable than what it currently is, because it just drags out so very long that it's incredibly boring. There is hardly anything to talk about with this episode because nothing happens. I mean, there's a little bit with Galadriel. Absolutely nothing happens with diverse elf and his baby mama and the kid aren't in this episode at all. Nothing, absolutely nothing happens with the wizard and the harfoots. There is just so little that happens in this episode that you could nearly cut this entire episode out beyond a few Numenor conversations, and it would not affect the season as a whole. I will be getting into spoilers from this point onward, so spoiler alert. So briefly, I do want to talk about the few good things I saw in it. Primarily, the orc designs were fine. I mean, the prosthetics for that were fine. I mean, they definitely wanted to whiten up the orcs. It definitely felt like to get away from the whole orcs or black people thing, which is absolutely a ridiculous accusation to label at Lord of the Rings or D&D or anything like that. Saying orcs are black people is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, but they definitely felt like they were trying to compensate for that criticism that has been labeled at orcs in the past. And all these orcs are very white, and that really ties into the whole, the diverse elf is in chains throughout the episode, which is absolutely not subtle whatsoever. And a lot of other people like me felt like that was just a little on the nose and a little pathetic, especially since you had the orcs in like white robes the whole time, so you definitely got clan vibes from them, and so it was incredibly pathetic overall. So just a few of the prosthetics in the faces alone is a positive, and some of the outdoor shots of Numenor were interesting and fine, and some of the sets of the outdoor of Numenor were fine, but as soon as you got into the interior of Numenor, things started to fall apart with very pathetic sets, incredibly cheap costumes. Holy crap. I still don't know where all the money for the most expensive television show ever made went to. This must be a laundering scheme because the costumes were incredibly cheap. It feels like they raided a Spirit Halloween right before filming and just got whatever they can get their hands on, because the Numenor scenes were incredibly pathetic from a costume and armor design standpoint. And then one good thing beyond all that I do have to mention is the elf in the puppet show that they had in Numenor actually looked like an elf, because in this episode, continued from the previous two, there was absolutely no difference between humans and elves visually besides their pointed ears. But at least the puppets, you could tell a stark difference between their puppets, between humans and elves beyond the ears. The puppets at least could tell the difference, whereas the casting and the show producers could not tell the difference, because there's absolutely no difference between the ears visually, and it's incredibly pathetic that the puppets got it better than the show and the casting overall. They just need to feel different. They need to feel ethereal. They need to feel beyond human and humanity in so many different aspects, and the puppets got it better than anything else, and that is really sad, but I guess technically positive for the puppet design. And again, there was another scene with Galadriel's super long name ripping off Game of Thrones with Daenerys, and it was incredibly cringe, just as we expected it to be, and just like it was in the previous couple episodes. Oh, she's the commander of the northern armies for King Gil-galad of the Elf. They just extended it to a far too extreme degree that is just really pathetic at this point. And they also included a lot of the same cringe dialogue in the previous episodes that they did in the previous episodes, that it was just really hard to listen to. This episode is only marginally better because it had less of this cringe dialogue. The rest of it was just all sorts of pompous and thinking it was super smart, but when you think about it for more than a half a second, you realize it is incredibly two-dimensional. I just think of that quote from Community. Sounds profound, is absolutely meaningless, though. That is every single line of dialogue in the Rings of Power. Even in this episode, the dialogue was horrific, and a lot of modern dialogue was included in this episode that just felt incredibly out of place, like some more yas, okays, and it's just not fantasy, and it's not medieval, and they just don't understand that. Of course, as they've said in the past, Amazon believes that any criticism of the show is just flat-out racism, so my criticism of the dialogue will, of course, be included as racism. And furthermore, besides the dialogue, the biggest issue of this episode was more comedy. They kept trying to be comedic in certain scenes that were just not landing well, similar to the whole wizard rolling down the hill in the previous episode. More cheap gags like that I found absolutely unfunny. Comedy is a little bit more subjective, but I just felt like the comedy was incredibly pathetic and out of place in so many situations in this episode. And probably my biggest, newest addition problem to this episode was Isildur and Elendil. Elendil was a giant nothing burger of a character. Everything that we got from his character was show don't tell to an extreme degree, and everything else was just bland nothing burger. I know absolutely nothing about Elendil because he's a terrible character. Elendil is so bad as a character. The actor does fine, I guess, fine enough. He's just not a good character. He offers nothing to the story. The most that we know about this character is his name might translate to friend of the elves. That's the most profound thing we get from this episode. So his name transition is what we get for this episode. Not actually anything about his character, and that name transition apparently affects who he is because he helps Galadriel a little bit. That doesn't inform anything on his character, however. And later on in the episode, he also says that the past is dead. We either move on or die with it. And this is more of a lore criticism, and if I'm wrong on this lore, please correct me in the comments below. But he's supposed to be the most faithful of Numenor, and he's supposed to be a lot more important of a figure than just some random boat captain. So to have the most faithful of Numenor just saying, oh, the past is worthless, let it die, we need to be future oriented, is incredibly contradictory to the actual character of Elendil in the story of Lord of the Rings, at least as far as I'm aware. So that just came across as incredibly disingenuous and contrary to lore as far as I knew it, and it just came across as just a bad character and poorly written. And the same issues plagued Isildur, because everything we know about Isildur is pretty much told to us either in the conversations with his boatmates who were like, oh, you had your head in your clouds, and they didn't show that. It was so much show don't tell in this episode. They absolutely do not trust the audience. They have to spell everything out with cringe dialogue. So it's like, oh, hey, see what you're seeing? You're seeing what you're seeing, right? You see what we're showing you, right? It's just so infuriating and condescending that they have to explain everything, and it's incredibly pathetic that they have this low of an opinion of their audience. The writers, at least, have such a low opinion of the audience that they have to tell everything and show nothing. There's so little to this episode, so little to the characterization of Isildur. It's all about show don't tell, and that continues on to the issues with Nori. Everything that we know about her is still tell don't show, and everything to do with her storyline can be condensed down to less than 5 minutes. Her storyline is nearly non-consequential, especially with the information provided in the previous 2 episodes, like her dad can't travel, already knew that, and her wizard does some dumb stuff that I'll get into in a minute here, and people find out about him and they're banished. Wow. You could almost do that in less than a minute. That is what happens with Nori. And then the wizard kind of helps at the end. So maybe a minute and a half. Wow. That is just concise storytelling at its absolute finest. The clearest sign of bad writing is bloat. That is the easiest sign of bad writing. And this episode is rife with it. And that's the first thing a writer looks at when they review their scripts, when they edit it, is this bloated? This episode was bloated, especially with the Nori storyline. And another storyline that was incredibly bloated was with the diverse elf storyline, which was just as bloated as the last few episodes. I'd say even more so, because all that happens is, oh, he's in chain. Diverse elf is in chains. Do you guys get that? Do you guys get that diverse elf is in chains? Do you get the metaphor? Do you get it? That seems to be the entire point, and then they have like a pathetic tree cutting down scene, and then they try to escape. Probably another minute needed, all we needed for the episode to understand his portion of the episode. This episode is so poorly written. I don't know why I'm saying it's marginally better. Man, it's marginally better because there's less stupid shit. It's still just as bad overall. It's just there's less cringe dialogue. It's so very, very bad. And the whole previous 2 episodes were saying, they're digging tunnels. They're digging tunnels, guys. Why are they digging tunnels between towns? Well, in this one, they're like, oh, orcs can't see the sunlight, which makes sense. That is lore accurate. But now they're digging trenches. Do you get that tunnels and trenches are different things? It's so sad. They just like, we need to be able to see our actors, so we're going to change what the orcs are trying to do. And the previous episode also said that the tunnels weren't dug by man or elf. Clearly dug by man or elf in this episode. The orcs aren't doing jack shit. They're just whipping them. Again, not subtle and not in any way connected to the previous episodes. This is writing 101 that this episode fails completely. And I think my metaphor of a 2-year-old with crayon writing this episode and the show as a whole is 100% accurate, because it doesn't feel like they watched the previous episodes to write these subsequent episodes. And Galadriel's escape from Numenor is also something that was entirely cut out of the episode entirely. Galadriel escaping from prison. You'd think that would be a big action sequence. No, they're just like, oh yeah, she's escaped. Yeah, I guess she's gone. Wow, Galadriel's escaped. And I do have to address a certain point of criticism that was labeled at my episode 1/2 review, is people were like, oh, why are you saying she's a Mary Sue, then also saying she's one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth? Magic use is different than physical and sword mastery. Magic and physical are different, okay? Magic and sword are incredibly different, especially because they downgraded the character or removed all that made her special. Her regalness, her magic use, her just splendor and wisdom. They took that all the way to make her generic sword woman as equal to the average elf, and then they made her so much better at fighting than the average elf for an inexplicable reason. That makes her a Mary Sue, because she's inexplicably better, even though she's supposedly equal to the other elves. That's what makes her a Mary Sue. So that would be my response to that pathetic criticism. But yeah, they just don't show her escape. Then she goes off to the library, which I'll get into in a second, and then she just comes back to the city as if nothing happens. You escape from prison, you want to get far away, but then she's just like, yeah, I escaped from prison from the sound. Well, I'm just awesome. I'm gonna walk back into the prison and talk to a prisoner. I'm just that good. Did they not think about that she just escaped from that very same prison Why would she be going back to talk to Halbrand? It's just an incredible degree of the writer's not even thinking about what she did in previous scene. Like, cut out a cool action sequence and then forgot about it when she comes back. It's just incredibly pathetic that they can't connect two scenes together to that degree alone. And then, if nothing else, once she does escape, she's incredibly ungrateful to Elendil, who saved her life. She made a terrible decision of trying to swim across an ocean, which is equal to double the journey that Frodo took to destroy the ring. She tried to swim double the distance that Frodo took to destroy the ring. And then she's mad at the boat that saves her life and picks her up. She's incredibly rude to Elendil, who I don't think is a good character, but she should still be thankful. She's incredibly rude and bitchy to him. Why do people think she's such a good character? She is a bitch, a bad person, and incredibly unlikable. And then it's just a stark contrast to the very next scene where she's shown riding a horse, which... it's just such a bad scene because the episode is already bloated to extreme degree and well over an hour long. We do not have time for slow motion. And the slow motion they show is the most emotion that she shows. In a non-consequential scene of her riding a horse, she shows more emotion than she has in 3 hours of television, almost 3.5 hours of television. In longer than entire movie of a Lord of the Rings movie, she's shown one major moment of talent and emotion, and it's in a slow-mo horse riding scene where she smiles a little bit. She's a terrible character, a terrible actress. Morford Clark is not meant for a role like this, and she's just terrible in the role. And that scene proves it because she is capable of so much better, but she's specifically choosing to be a flat-faced bitch throughout the entire episode and the entire show in totality. It's just really weird, the slow-mo scene that drags the episode to a grinding halt that shows more emotion than everything in total. It was just really pathetic, this entire scene. The scene that shows that she is capable of smiling. And then Halbrand has some scenes where he's like drinking with some guys. It's really weird and awkward. And then he has a really slow fight. It wasn't slow-mo, but that choreography with the fight was just really slow. It felt like any guy who had any sort of reflexes should have been able to beat Halbrand. I don't know if that was just me. That fight sequence just felt like it was really, really slow and really pathetic and really poorly choreographed. I don't know. That might just be me. If it's just me, just let me know. But that fight sequence was so slow, and it felt like he was punching at half speed. It was really weird, really pathetic, especially considering who Halbrand actually is. And then we get to the scene I mentioned earlier where she's actually in the library with Elendil trying to figure out, some messages, and it's weird why she went to it. She didn't really mention, she didn't explain why she wanted to go to this random ass library, and then she just sees a Mark of Sauron again, and she immediately figures out what it is. What? She doesn't even read the black speech that's a part of that parchment before she's like, Mark of Sauron, Southernlands or Mordor, the same shape, same. You see, shape is the same. The elves had been studying that symbol for decades, centuries in fact, and they hadn't figured out what the Mark of Sauron was and that it coalesced with a map of Middle-earth, and then she just sees it again randomly and randomly figured it out, even though she's been working on it for centuries as well. This show doesn't show her as intelligent. It merely dumbs down the entire cast of characters to such a degree that Galadriel is equal to the writers, because no writer can write a more intelligent character than they themselves are. And so she just comes across as so much smarter than everyone else because they dumb down every other character to dumber than the writers themselves are. But if you think about it for more than a second, she is an incredibly dumb character. So what does that say about the writers who thought that this was profound, this scene and all the dialogue in general? The writers think everything that they do is profound because they use such flowery dialogue that absolutely means nothing. But they haven't made Galadriel the wise character that we know her to be. They've just dumbed down everyone so she seems smart by comparison, even though she still only has a double-digit IQ by comparison. Why did she randomly figure out the Mark of Sauron with no information provided, additional information provided to help her solve the puzzle? She's just like, oh, I've seen that before. I've been actually studying this for hundreds of years, but suddenly I know it looked like Mappy shape. Mappy shape. Let's put that. They're the same. Mappy shape and symbol are the samesies. I'm so smartsies. Everyone else is dumbsies. It's incredibly condescending and pathetic that the writers think that this is smart. Galadriel does not come across as smart in this scene as much as they try. And a lot of people have said in the comments, oh, this is the beginning of her character arc. Don't you know what a character arc is? She might change. No, they're already portraying her as perfect and incredibly smart and right. You can't progress to a better character from perfect, absolutely smart, and right. There's going to be no character arc for Galadriel, as there has been no character arc for her throughout these 3 episodes so far. After just the terrible Galadriel Elendil stuff, we get back to the harfoots for a little while, which are just harfoots that shouldn't exist, but that's more lore stuff that I've covered in the previous review. And it's a lot more of show don't tell about the personality of Nori and some pathetic stuff, and some more attempts at comedy that just really aren't landing, and more Sadak Burrow acting like an idiot. I don't know why Lenny Henry acted like his involvement in this world was so profound when his character is such an idiot, but it's just some really pathetic stuff. And they act like the line of full carts means full bellies is such a profound statement. Even Lenny Henry's like, ooh, that's good. And the writers are like, see, that's a good line. I said a good line. Is that a good line? And then he tells it to everyone, and everyone laughs, and he's like, yeah, that is a good line. No, full bellies or full carts means a full belly is an average line at the very best and shouldn't be highlighted more than normal. But they act like it's so profound. It's like, this is the best you can offer. I feel like overall this episode is the best that the show can offer. I do still stand by that it's marginally better than the previous 2, but I do feel like it's the best that the show writers are capable of. And the Harfoot scenes really prove that point, where they just act like it's so profound. And the wizard just randomly walks into camp. We don't know why he decides to walk into camp, and he randomly finds star charts randomly, which doesn't make any sense, where he just stumbles across them immediately, and then he stupidly lights them on fire. And it's just really pathetic. I don't know. It's supposed to be comedy, but the wizard is just like, I walk into village. I find what I need. I light on fire what I need. How sadsies. I'm big and dumsy klutzy. What the fuck is this characterization of the wizard? It is so bad. It is so very bad, and it's made worse later on in a moment here when we get back to the Harfoots and the wizard in a moment. But we're going back to Elendil and Galadriel, and it's more of the, make everyone else dumber to make her seem smarter. And they have the quote with Isildur's fake sister and some scenes with Isildur that are just really tell, don't show, as of always. But yeah, Isildur's sister doesn't exist. And then it's that terrible line from Elendil of, the past is dead. We either move on or we die with it. In and of itself, that is incredibly on the nose line that speaks to Amazon's approach to this series and the source material as a whole. And it also, was in The Last Jedi and implied their approach to it, which destroyed that entire fan base. It took a while, but The Last Jedi really did the trick, as this will do the trick for the Lord of the Rings fans. It's just a terrible line that speaks to their thought process and feels entirely out of place in the world, because another lore-wise comment is Elendil is supposed to be the most faithful, which means he should be the most in tune to the past. Numenor at this point should be practicing like human sacrifices and stuff like that, so he should be the most against that type of future mentality that Numenor is starting to practice in, and be the most involved in the past. But it's like, the past is dead, we either move. It's just not Elendil in any way, shape, or form, and it's just a terrible line and a terrible mentality that the writers are taking as a whole. So it's just as cringe as it was in the trailers, but even worse in context as a whole. And then Galadriel comes back to the prison, the very prison that she was imprisoned in, and she's like, yeah, I escaped from you guys, but I want to talk to my boyfriend. Let me pass. I want to talk to my boyfriend. And no one bothers to stop her. Escape from prison? Ooh, that's bad. Oh, come back to prison? Ah, that's fine, girl, fam, girl, that's fine. So she just somehow gets us back to Halbrand and has this long conversation about how he's the destined king to the Southlands, and it's just fake Aragorn vibes to the 9th degree. They created a character out of scratch. Halbrand is not an actual Tolkien character just to be a Aragorn stand-in, and we all know he's supposed to be Sauron, so it's incredibly pathetic that the one strong male character who is an Aragorn stand-in is actually secretly the villain. It's incredibly on the nose with some more lines about how he's secretly Sauron, and it's really pathetic as a whole. But yeah, it's just fake Sauron. And why does Galadriel not think about the luck involved, where she's just randomly swimming through the ocean and happens to find the destined king of an entire kingdom in the middle of the ocean. She tries to say that it's fate or whatnot. That is not a good enough explanation for the type of Galadriel that this character is. Now, the previous Galadriel, who was more in tune with the universe, who was more wise, who was more magical oriented, who dealt with prophecy, it would make sense why she would believe in fate and stuff like this. But this character of Galadriel cares not for fate or anything beyond the ability of her to swing a sword against Sauron. That's all she cares about. So this Galadriel has not been portrayed in such a way that she cares about fate. So why doesn't she question that she happens to run across the heir to the Southlands? Well, because the writers didn't think about it. And it is coincidental that she runs across him. But that's too big brain. We don't think big brain. Again, another example of dumbing everyone down, and Galadriel's just stupid to begin with, so they dumb everyone out down to a degree that she sounds smart by comparison. But she isn't, actually. Then we get back to the harfoots and the wizards for a little bit. Some really pathetic stuff, the wizard helping them, and the wizard randomly learns English suddenly, and it's like, Nori, friend, you're my friend. The wizard has no context for what friend means whatsoever besides Nori said it. It could mean snail for all he knows because she had a snail in that scene. Suddenly learns a few words of English. That doesn't make any sense. So that's as much as that scene offered to us whatsoever. And then we get back to the final sequence of the episode, which is with the verse elf, Arondir, where he has this harebrained free the elves and humans harebrained scheme that doesn't make any sense. They do a little bitty distraction, and then they pile all the chains on top of each other and try to axe them to death. If you stack metal on top of metal, it makes it harder to cut metal. It was so freaking dumb. And throughout the entire fight sequence, there's more than enough of them to actually defeat those few orcs that are standing there. So maybe focus on killing the orcs first and then cutting your chains based on the scenario that's involved in the sequence. No. We're just going to focus on a chain and ignore the orcs, except for Arondir cutting a post and collapsing a little canopy on them. That's all they're going to do. That's actually against the orcs. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever and portrays everyone involved as incredibly stupid. And then the warg involved is just terrible CGI. Again, I normally wouldn't focus on the CGI in a television show like this, but this is the most expensive television show ever made, so the CGI is well within my rights to criticize, and this CGI on this warg was absolutely pathetic for a television show of this caliber, and the fight sequence was really pathetic. Again, they're focusing on the chains rather than trying to kill the warg, and overall it's just a bad fight sequence with the orcs just kind of standing there pulling on the chains, and it's choreographed like a 2-year-old with crayon. Once again, it's just overall a terrible addition to the episode and the only fight sequence to be featured within this entire medieval fantasy episode. Again, this episode could be condensed down to 15 minutes and you would lose absolutely nothing, and you would actually include one single fight sequence. In a 15-minute fantasy show, well, one single fight sequence is fair, but in an hour and 20 minutes, and you only get one minor terrible fight sequence, that's not good. And that's all this episode had to offer, and it was incredibly pathetic, and overall the warg fight was just a terrible way to end the episode, especially with everyone dying and Arondir getting captured again and him just being all sad but not showing any sadness. The actor, everyone's been praising him, but I don't think he's actually that good. And it's just bad. It's bad when I wish for Disa and Durin to return to the episode. They were the best parts of the last episode, still not good, and just competent actors. They were competent actors, and I find myself wishing for that, even though they still have terrible writing, terrible dialogue, and nonsensical scenery and planning with the tree. Tree, it has light, but why does it grow? It's a puzzlement. Oh, it's lovesies. That's what makes it grow, not the light seas and the watering. It's the lovesies. This episode made me crave that sequence with Durin and Disa, and that's really quite an astonishing fact to me. And that is where the episode closes out. So this episode is I struggle with saying marginally better, but I'm still going to stick with that it's marginally better than the previous 2 episodes, mainly because it features a whole lot less dialogue and a whole lot less Galadriel than the first episode. And it's still just terribly written, like a 2-year-old with crayon. Nothing makes sense. Nothing ties together. And there's still some non sequiturs in there. There's still some terrible transitions and a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense whatsoever. But it was over. After an hour and 20 minutes, the episode was over and sweet release was mine. And I'm just going to go watch some good Doctor Who to make up for that abysmal episode that I just watched. Overall, even though it's marginally better, I think the best I can give this episode is a 2.5 because of all of the issues I mentioned previously. It is still a terrible episode of television. television, a terrible adaptation of Tolkien, a terrible fantasy show, and just a terribly written show as a whole. And it's so sad that a few people, very few people, because the general consensus is negative, that a few people believe that this show is good because it's written like a 2-year-old with crayon. That is my metaphor that I will stick with. And it's a much better metaphor than stone, it looked down and sinkies, but boat, it looked up to light seas and float seas. Still doesn't make any sense after a week. Still doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to stick with my 2-year-old with crayon because that still makes more sense. Overall, those are my thoughts of this episode. Again, lore experts, if you have any clarifications on stuff that I missed, please absolutely let me know. I want to know clarifications or things I got wrong lore-wise. And I just didn't like this. It's so boring. And again, boring is incredibly subjective, but the pacing was incredibly off. It was just bad. Just a flat line of bad was the absolute best that can be said about this terrible episode of television. But anyway, that's all I have for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Anon. If you like what I do here and want to see good, compelling stories that Hollywood will no longer give you, check out my book series, Odyssey of a Phoenix, a mythological epic about philosophy, morality, and modern-day mental illness issues. Books 1, Down in Flames, and Book 2, Apocalypse Then, currently on sale. Book 3, Kill the Dark, coming soon.